much, Stuart. Thank you for the introduction. I'd like to get an understanding before I start about where you are on the subject of GDPR. So, would you mind helping me if your organisation, your complete organisation, not just departments, has undertaken a GDPR readiness programme, gap analysis, or anything that seriously addresses the subject right across the organisation? Do you mind putting your hands up if you're doing that? Doing it? Yeah. So about a third to a half. Good, thank you. Next question. How many of you think GDPR is fun? One, my colleague. Well, that I hope I can change during the course of this morning. I've been asked to pick on the IT relevance of GDPR. What does the legislation actually say about it? And there is a phrase in there that's the title there, using appropriate technical or organisational measures. So what I'm going to do is go through some background in the legislation to put it in context and then draw out what the legislation actually obliges us all to do. A bit about us. Stuart introduced us as a consultancy. We're Leeds-based, but we work all over the UK and indeed in various European countries. The work for the last couple of years has been doing gap analysis to explain to people where they are and where they need to be. And of course, 2 years ago, that was about legislation that was barely even understood at that point. Now we've got people who are asking for the gap analysis because they realise they've got a serious problem looming fast. But we do a lot of project work, we handhold people through achieving compliance, and although the prominent subject at the moment is GDPR, it's not just that. We work in the field of PCI DSS, BS 27001, so it's compliance in general. A lot of charities, some of them local, a lot of sports organisations. Sorry, I've already overshot my slide. Some of these local, Liverpool, Everton. We are actually the statutory data protection officer for Everton, because that's one of the things that the legislation says, that you can outsource the role of data protection officer. And a lot of commercial organisations that we work with as well. It's coming, and it's coming fast. We've not got very long to go, but Dave and I were at the Information Commissioners Conference in Manchester on Monday, and the Commissioner, Elizabeth Denham, made it quite clear that, in her view, May the 25th is not a deadline, it's the start of organisations becoming compliant with the legislation. There's been a lot of scare because the original legislation, having been introduced from Europe 2 years ago, gave governments 2 years to incorporate it into statute, and there was a view that it gave organisations 2 years to become compliant. Well, quite frankly, that was almost impossible, because the GDPR is still going through the British Houses of Parliament at the moment, and is still getting changed at the moment. So there is precious little chance of any organisation being 100% compliant on the 25th of May. So why was it necessary? Well, there was a view in Europe, and one that was largely led by the United Kingdom, by the way, that the legislation that had been around since 1998 was a barrier to free trade. People didn't have enough trust in the legislation, and therefore were wary about giving their data. And you only have to look at what's been going on with Facebook in the last couple of weeks to realise how genuine that fear should have been. And the big problem with the previous legislation is that it was introduced and every national government was given the chance to make their own national variant of it, and indeed they did. So we ended up with 28 different versions of the Data Protection Act, one in each country, and there are significant differences between some of them. Even ours and the Republic of Ireland's has real differences. So the R in GDPR means it's a regulation, and the idea there is it will be consistent legislation across Europe. The ICO, who I mentioned, sorry, I'm seeing different things down there to what's here. I'll try and keep my eye on the right. So there are differences between the Data Protection Act, but it is an evolution, it's not a revolution. If you are compliant with the Data Protection Act, there's a good chance you'll be 95% compliant with GDPR. There are some new things that needed to be looked at, but a lot of it is common sense, and it's about having respect for people's data. in the same way that you wouldn't put money in a bank if you thought the bank was going to be careless with it and leave it lying around. The same applies with personal data. If you, as a citizen, give your personal data to an organisation, you expect them to look after it and treat it with respect. Some of the differences are down there, different principles, but they're only slight changes, and I'll show you those in another slide. Implied consent was allowed under the Data Protection Act. It no longer is in GDPR. Consent now has to be explicit. We, as citizens, have all got extended rights, far greater rights than we had under the Data Protection Act, and I'll cover those. Processors, that is, organisations that worked on behalf of the controller, were previously exempt from any liability in the Data Protection Act. The processor now has its own unique liabilities. Now, as most IT-based organisations, certainly those providing hosting services, are processors in terms of the legislation, that means they take on a whole load of new responsibilities that weren't there before. With it being European legislation, there's a great stress on this being legislation that is consistent across Europe, but it applies to all European citizens wherever they are in the world. So I'm reading a lot in the American IT press and the American security press at the moment how American organisations are realising that this applies to them as well if they're processing data on European citizens. And the regime of fines is considerably higher, but one of the other things that the Information Commissioner has been keen to repeat is don't believe the hype that organisations are going to get hit with these massive fines of 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover. It's there as a threat, but the Commissioner was making it quite clear that there isn't a hidden hit list. They're not going to be jumping all over companies in June of next year and levying huge fines. They believe in the carrot and the stick. So a bit about the ICO. The terminology in the GDPR is a supervisory authority, and each nation state in the European Union has one. In this country, it's the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, and they are responsible for enforcing the law and for providing guidance. So it's a tremendous source of information. If you haven't yet looked at the information on the Information Commissioner's website, I commend it to you. It's absolutely full of information on guidance on how to comply and sector-specific guidance as well. There's a whole section for SMEs. There's a whole section for local authorities and local government. It's a great site. And increasingly, information being put on there about best practice and how-to guidelines. It also posts the offenders that have been prosecuted, and that's quite useful because that's a great way of learning from other people's mistakes, seeing the sorts of things that people get fined for or the things that people get enforcement notices for is quite an educational thing. Just a bit of a light bit about what's going on with the world of Facebook. The approach that the ICO has been taking regarding marketing, Stuart alluded to this, it's increasingly difficult to communicate directly to a potential audience when the law says you can't do that unless they've consented to receive the communication. But one of the things that is often overlooked is the GDPR stands alongside another piece of legislation, the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulation, or PECA as it's known by its initials, and that still applies. It's not superseded by GDPR, and it will also get upgraded, and we will have a new version of PECA. Everybody's hoping it will be by the 25th of May, but there's no firm commitment from the ICO of when they can incorporate the changes that are coming out of Europe on that. So that's what's covering direct marketing. I'm not going to cover that in a great deal of detail today, but it's important to make that distinction. GDPR is all about a risk-based approach. Throughout the recitals of the legislation, it constantly refers to organisations taking appropriate measures. It never says what appropriate means, other than it's in relation to the risk. And risk is usually in relation to scale of processing and the degree to which that's intrusive, and also to the nature of the data being processed. So if you're processing data about criminal convictions or healthcare data or sexual orientation or mental health, you need to have a higher regard to the security of that data. And therefore, when I go through slides later on, I want you to constantly bear in mind that it's this appropriate technological and organisational, and we're all led to form our own conclusions about what is appropriate. Mention a little bit about the fines, but let's just make it clear that it's not the only remedy that the ICO has. The ICO would be much happier giving an enforcement notice to say you've done something wrong, this is what you've got to do to put it right, and I'm going to come back in 6 months' time and inspect you. It's only people who flagrantly flout the law that are likely to get hit with the larger fines. But of course, you want to avoid it as an organisation, because if you are found to be in breach, that opens up your organisation to claims in the courts for damages, and of course, it's notoriously bad PR. Organisations like TalkTalk, when they had their nasty breach, lost thousands of customers and will find it very difficult to regain public trust. And we're absolutely swamped with examples of what's going on. Usually the lurid ones that hit the headlines are to do with cyber attacks, but we've got cases like a disgruntled finance director at Morrison's who's been getting his organisation into trouble, and then endless other examples of Mumsnet and organisations all over the place. You don't want to be in those newspaper headlines. That's bad PR, and the cost of clear-up from these sorts of things can be horrendous. The fines are covered by Article 83 in the legislation, and as I said, it's one of several sanctions, but let's just be clear about the scale of what else there is. These are all things that the ICO can do. Compliance orders through the courts, fixed penalties, penalty notices. It's not all about fines, and the ICO will also be proportionate to the scale of the wrongdoing or the lack of attention that was given to security in an organisation. I deliberately am not going to talk through every one of my slides because I've got far more than I need, so if I skip over them, you'll be getting these slides at the end, so don't worry about the detail. And this was a statement from the Information Commissioner back last year, but I heard her on Monday repeating pretty much the same thing. We need to understand what's meant by a breach, and that's defined in the legislation. But of course, the public tend to think of a breach as being the classic cyber attack, or their email account being hacked. And you've got websites like this where you can put in an email address, and it will tell you if there are known occurrences of your email address being out in the world of the black arts of hackers. And usually you will find that unless you're specifically paying attention to this sort of thing, your email address will be out there somewhere, because there have been so many breaches over the years. And of course, you then get to the appropriate controls of keeping yourself secure, keeping your password up to date, and so on. Right, let's have a look at the principles. I mentioned in the introduction that there are 7 principles in the GDPR as opposed to 8 in the Data Protection Act, and there's a comparison between them. I'm not going to dwell on any of these in detail because I want to get to the meat of my presentation, which is about appropriate technological measures. But we've got a really important one here, that data will be treated with appropriate security. So that's where the legislation is starting to bring out what the responsibilities of organisations for technology are. And this is a really big one, and the completely new one, which is that under the GDPR, organisations have a responsibility to demonstrate compliance. It's not sufficient to say, yeah, we're compliant, we're happy we're compliant. You need a set of policies, procedures, and records to prove that you're compliant. So, keep evidence, and I'll come to some examples of that later. The first principle is about lawfulness and fairness and transparency. And transparency is another word that runs throughout the legislation. And the best way that I can summarise what is meant by transparency is that you will all have a much greater and much more prescribed a set of a set of things you need to cover in a privacy notice. Under the Data Protection Act, there was a few. Under GDPR, there's a much longer list. And that's the transparency part, about telling people what you will be doing with their data. And a great test, and it's a test you can use for yourself as you deal with other organisations, is would I be surprised or would I be annoyed to find out an organisation was doing something with my data? If you're not surprised and you're not annoyed, they're probably being fair. That is the test, and that is what transparency is all about. We have a new set of lawful conditions that make the processing of data legitimate. The Data Protection Act only had a couple, and we've got 6 now. I'm going to go through them at a gallop because this is a huge subject in its own right, but I just want to set it into context because it leads on to responsibilities later. Consent is one of the lawful conditions for processing data, and historically it's the one that people have generally got hung up about. They've gone out of their way to make sure that data collection forms have got an appropriate consent statement. Well, if you rely on consent, that is still important, and in fact more important than ever. But there are 5 other conditions that make it lawful to process personal data. A really important one is the performance of a contract. So any classic contract for the sale of goods or services, but it's also things like the sale of membership. Anything that's a contract, you have a right to retain the personal data of somebody to be able to fulfill that contract. You can process personal data in pursuance of a legal obligation, other than a contract. And in life and death situations, you can process personal data, including the sensitive personal data about people's health, to try and keep them alive in a life and death situation. But that is not something that a commercial organisation is ever going to be able to rely on. Public authorities are now advised to steer away from consent and to steer away from one that's not yet uncovered legitimate interest, because a specific legitimising reason has been created for public authorities, and that's a task carried out in the public interest. And the one that's probably the most flexible of all is that you can process personal data if it is in your legitimate interest to do so. But that's not just a catch-all that says, of course it's legitimate, of course we have to process data, it's what we do. You have to go through a balancing test and make sure that your rights are not outweighed by the rights of the data subject. But it's a very flexible legitimising condition, and I think you'll see that a lot of commercial organisations will move from consent to legitimate interest. If you still rely on consent, and you certainly still need consent to send marketing materials under the privacy and electronic communication regulations, then there's a much tighter definition. It has to be freely given, no duress, it's got to be a real choice. It has to be specific, it can't be bundled in with other things. It has to be informed, so people need to know what it is that they're consenting to. They have to be given unambiguous information. It can't be buried in legalese where the intention is to confuse people. The data subject has to be given a real opportunity to give a clear affirmative statement. And so, for example, a pre-ticked box, which has been used extensively in the past, will now not constitute consent. If you're using a tick box approach, it has to be unticked, and there's a move towards radio buttons rather than tick boxes because they demand that one or the other radio button has to be pressed, and that's definitely a clear affirmative action. And the whole thing has got to be wrapped up around the privacy policy or the wording that makes it absolutely clear what somebody is consenting to. And you then, of course, keep a record of that consent. Legitimate interest is a bit different. We will cover all of these. You carry out a balancing test, and by the way, all of this is covered on the Information Commissioner's website. There's guidance to how to carry out a legitimate interest assessment. Carry out a balancing test to weigh up your interests as an organisation versus the interests of the data subject. And ultimately, if the whole thing is fair, then you can use legitimate interest. Special categories of personal data get separate treatment. This is what used to be called sensitive personal data under the Data Protection Act, and it's all the sorts of things you would expect to be kept a little bit more controlled. And these have their own separate legitimising conditions, or more to the point, you have to satisfy one of the previous 6 conditions plus a further condition. But I'm not going to go into the detail because, quite frankly, we run a whole day workshop on this subject. We can't cover this subject in a few minutes. But highlighting in red there is the sorts of reasons that you can process this type of data, that you have explicit consent to do so, or that in the field of employment, for example, you might have to keep data on ethnicity to satisfy discrimination laws. So there are conditions that justify it. There are some examples in practice of what legitimising condition is appropriate to a certain type of data. And as I said, organisations are increasingly advised to move away from consent. The real danger with relying on consent is that we all have a right to withdraw consent. So if you as an organisation are depending upon somebody's consent and then they withdraw it, you have to stop processing their data. So it's not a good place to be relying entirely on consent. Back to the checklist here of what is under the subject of lawfulness, fairness and transparency. Telling people what you're going to be doing with their data is an essential part of satisfying transparency. Now this next slide is a comparison. Well, I'm just about to lead to this because this slide compares what is mandatory under the current legislation, the 1998 Data Protection Act, and what will become mandatory from the 25th of May under GDPR. So this is what I mean by don't mess with privacy policies. Only 3 things are currently mandatory on a privacy policy. Now, organisations tend to create 4, 5, 6-page privacy policies because they want to say a lot more, but the law only asks for 3 things. And I won't bother reading them out because you can see them there and you're going to get the slides. What's more important is under the GDPR, how many more things are a legal requirement to go in a privacy policy. So, whereas before, as long as you said, this is who we are, we're the data controller, this is the type of data that we process about you and why, now you've got all sorts of other things that you must do to satisfy the law. One of the ones that is going to affect a lot of organisations is if you need to process data outside the European Economic Area, you have to say so, and you have to explain which organisations are doing that. Now, in the world of shadow IT, a lot of the organisations like Dropbox and the like are based in America. So you have to state if you're using systems like Dropbox. It is legal to do so because they're covered by a piece of legislation called Privacy Shield that gives a guarantee that their data protection laws are equivalent to European ones. But you still have to say that in your privacy policy. And if you're using processors to process data on your behalf, and that includes organisations like hosting companies that just host data, you have to either name them or name the categories of organisations that you're using. So this, to answer your question, is what I mean with don't mess with privacy policies, because this will be highly visible. This will be out there for the whole world to see, and it will be equally easy for the world to see if you're breaching the law if you fail to mention one of these mandatory things. This checklist, by the way, is directly from the Information Commissioner's website. Loads of information available there.
So if you use, say, DPD carriers, do you have to name DPD or just carriers?
Right. Well, the principle of your question is totally valid, but I want to come back to a detailed answer as well. If you are using a category of organisations, for example, let's say you use 3 different web hosting companies hosting 3 different parts of your systems, it is sufficient to say we use hosting organisations to host our data because we are not professional database specialists. The detail of your question is that technically any form of carrier or postal service is not regarded as a processor anyway. It's a strange anomaly, that's covered in the ICO's guidance. The ICO takes the view that they are merely a conduit that gets the information from place A to B, that they're not actually processing the data. Strange anomaly, one worth looking up. You have to explain the purposes for which you're processing the data. This is again all part of what needs to be in the privacy policy. And sorry, I've skipped a slide. You should ideally start that journey with creating an information asset register. It's part of the consulting process that we go through. Understand your data, document it, find out where all those pots of data are, and that includes shadow IT things like small access databases or complex spreadsheets and pivot tables that might hold business critical data. Find out where they are, document them. It's critical that you know where your organisation's data is being held, because only then can you inform the public about it via the privacy policy. The data has to be appropriate and limited to what is required. So a principle that runs throughout the legislation about data minimisation. You can no longer allow people to keep data just in case it comes in handy at some point in the future. That will not be lawful. You should only be keeping the personal data that you can justify, that you need, and then you can guarantee that you keep safe. Auditing is a recommendation that runs throughout the GDPR, because it's all very well becoming compliant. It's then vitally important that you remain compliant, and of course things change, your organisation changes, your staff change, your business model changes. So routine audit is the way to stay on top of that. Data has to be accurate and where necessary kept up to date. Now that's quite a burden on organisations. We all know that accurate and up-to-date data is very useful to have, but how do you prove it? How do you satisfy the law that your data is accurate? Well, it's all again about appropriate technological and organisational measures. It's all about having a procedure, and that might be as simple as saying whenever somebody contacts our call centre, we always get a check performed on their latest address, their latest email address. Whatever suits your organisation, the word appropriate stands in front of every one of these elements. A practical approach. Now, coming now to the bits that really affect the world of IT and technology. The letter of the law is saying that data should be kept in a form which permits identification of data subjects for no longer than is necessary. So this is about retention policies. This is about deciding how long you need to keep data, or how long certain statutes oblige you to keep data, and then sticking to that, and deleting the data afterwards, or potentially anonymising it, so that it is no longer personally identifiable information. Now, this is an area where IT may well be asked to enforce that. So if somebody says we are going to keep our employment records for 6 years after the employee leaves the organisation, that makes sense, because that's subject to the statute of limitations on a contract, which is 6 years. But how do you then guarantee that 6 years after somebody leaves the organisation, their employment records will be deleted? Typically, that starts to become an IT role. And when you dig into the legislation, you start seeing things where you put a ring around it and think, that's an IT job. Nobody else is going to do that for you, certainly not in large-scale processing. You may choose to anonymise the data when it reaches the end of its retention period, particularly if you need it for historical analysis purposes. You might want to look at trends going back 30 years, but you don't need to know the names and addresses of the people related to that. You just want to know, was that service going up or was that service going down? Have we got more of type X than we've got type Y? So if you choose to anonymise the data, you can keep it indefinitely because it's no longer personally identifiable. But that almost certainly becomes an IT challenge. Who else has got the ability to write the hashing algorithms to anonymise data? Big red circle around this one. Data will be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security of the personal data, including protection against unauthorised or unlawful processing. Well, this is screaming out firewalls, antivirus, all the classic barriers against intrusion. But it's also against accidental loss and damage. So it's things like having a policy for bring your own device. It's about having a policy concerning USB connected devices. And underlined appropriate technical or organisational measures. And this comes under the headings that follows a nice acronym, CIA, confidentiality, integrity and availability. It's everybody's responsibility, but I can see IT playing a huge role in satisfying this. Some examples: organisational versus technical. So your technical measures are the firewalls, antivirus, a routine for patching to stay up to the latest releases of software, password and two-factor authentication, monitoring, logging, whereas the practical stuff is about having policies and procedures that people actually follow and understand, carrying out appropriate checks on people's trustworthiness, such as CRB checks if they're working with vulnerable people, or verifying degrees if people come to the organisation and say, yes, I've got a PhD in cryptography. Do you just believe them, or do you verify that? Training, clear desk. Clear desk is so simple but so important to GDPR, because leaving personal data lying around on a desk is a classic opportunity for a breach. If you look at the ICO's website, one of the very latest breaches is a police force fined £150,000 because they left 3 CDs on a policeman's desk containing CCTV images of an interview with an alleged rapist and victim. And the CDs just disappeared off the policeman's desk. They don't know that they were stolen. It's just that one day they were there and the next day they weren't. It's a clear example of where, first of all, the ICO said they should have been encrypted, and they weren't. And secondly, you shouldn't have just left them lying on a desk. So it's a clear thing that people are going to get fined for not having a clear desk policy. It's so simple, but it's so important. Next one with a big ring around it is, imagine that you've got a limited budget. I guess you all face that problem, don't we all? And you've discovered you've got 10 types of really important data that you've got to keep safe. You haven't got the budget to do it all overnight, so what do? Well, the whole advice of GDPR throughout is this is risk-based, so carry out a risk assessment. Which are the most important or the most vulnerable items of data, and carry out a risk assessment and work out what you're going to do about it, and employ the strongest protection possible to the most risky data, or the data that poses the greatest risk. And at the end of it, you will take either technical or organisational measures, or possibly both. If your organisation hasn't already got a data protection risk register, it certainly should have one. Because item 1 on that register should say, we recognise that the processing of personal data by our organisation poses a risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects. If you don't recognise that, you're failing to comprehend what GDPR is all about. So your data protection risk register should start with that line and then become more granular about the elements that pose specific risks and that need specific treatment. The controller should be responsible for and able to demonstrate compliance with. So demonstrate, this is now all about the record keeping, evidence of audits, evidence of compliance checks, evidence that if you're outsourcing activities to a processor to process on your behalf, that you've carried out due diligence on them. They are obliged to give you assurance that they themselves are compliant with the GDPR. Now, what you accept as assurance is up to you. You might say, well, we're going to come on site and audit you physically, or you might say, we're going to give you a due diligence questionnaire, we'd like you to fill that out, please. Or you might say, well, you've got ISO 27001, just show us the certificate and that's sufficient. So you make your own decisions, but you must do something to perform due diligence on your processes. And indeed, if you're a processor yourself as an organisation, and your work is about providing processing services to clients, you're going to get a lot of people asking you for that sort of evidence before long.
So would you still do that with a carrier?
No, because they're not treated as being a processor. You may still want to do it under the headings of confidentiality, but it's not a legal obligation under GDPR to do the due diligence on them as a processor. Right, so how do you demonstrate compliance? Well, the next few slides are sections from our information governance framework. We've created a set of policies, procedures and registers that can be tailored to suit any organisation and provide you with that record keeping. They have to be tailored to suit your own organisation's specifics, but the framework is there for you. So the first thing about demonstrating compliance is that you have an information security policy, that you do have rules about things like when cryptography is required. You do have things like a starter leaver mover policy, so that when new employees come in, they're subject to role-based access control, they're issued with their security passes, and even more importantly, when they leave, all that is rapidly rescinded. And that is in a policy that you can demonstrate. Specific IT policies need to be there to prove that IT is taking appropriate technological measures. As I said, it's not sufficient that you simply do them. You might be an extremely well-run IT organisation or an IT internal department, and you might be extremely good at doing everything according to the legislation. But unless you can prove it, you're still not complying. So various things like a mobile device policy, a remote working or teleworking policy, so that you state, this is what we do, and you stick to it and you enforce it. In terms of physical security, it's almost limitless. Penetration testing, firewalls, endpoint protection, whatever you choose to do, there are no rules about what it must be, other than it must be appropriate. But when you choose to do it, you must document it, stick to it, and be able to provide the evidence to the world at large, and particularly the ICO if they ask to see it, that this is our policy, this is what we do. Under the subject of cryptography, becoming increasingly important because the guidance is that if you encrypt data, it ceases to be regarded as personally identifiable information. So, for example, if you lost a laptop containing personal data, and that might include your Outlook address book, not necessarily a sensitive file, and it was not encrypted, that's a breach. That has to be reported by law to the Information Commissioner's Office within 72 hours. If the whole laptop was encrypted using BitLocker or a third-party product, it's not regarded as being personally identifiable, so it's not reportable. You might internally still record it because the loss or theft of the laptop you want to know about. It's a company asset, but it wouldn't have to be reported to the ICO. So cryptography, really important to try and avoid breaches. And of course, it applies to servers as well. If you're encrypting the data at rest on servers, then even a major hack would not constitute the loss of personally identifiable information. You need to have a security incident and breach procedure, not just to satisfy the law, but the speed at which these things work now. The GDPR demands that you report a breach if it is reportable. There are things that are reportable and things that aren't, within 72 hours. So you've got to have a well-oiled machine behind you to, first of all, contain the problem, take remedial action immediately, carry out the most rapid possible risk assessment to decide, have we put at risk the rights and freedoms of data subjects, in other words, their personal data? Have we lost bank details? Have we lost credit card details? Have we lost names and addresses? Have we lost telephone numbers? Once you've worked through that in a sort of triage approach, you may conclude it's a breach, but it's not one that we have to report to the ICO, or we might conclude, yeah, we've got to report that to the ICO within 72 hours. If you fail to report within 72 hours, you've broken another law, so you could end up being fined twice, once for the original breach and once for failing to report within 72 hours. So having a well-oiled procedure for breach notification and what to do in the case of a security incident is really important. And it's all about bringing your staff up to the sort of same level of professional approach to this that anybody in IT would already be taking. You don't want a staff member banging on the door, breathless, saying, I've lost my laptop, what do I do? Am I going to get sacked? You should be saying, calm down, let's get to the facts, and we'll follow the procedure, and we'll decide whether we need to report that or not. Disaster recovery and business continuity been extremely important for many years, but not a lot of smaller organisations could say we've got a comprehensive business continuity plan, and quite a few smaller organisations would admit that we haven't got a full-scale disaster recovery plan, we haven't got the budget for it or whatever. But this is now not so much made mandatory by GDPR, it's just that GDPR is pushing that you can't possibly satisfy the availability part of the CIA acronym, confidentiality, integrity, availability, without a disaster recovery plan and a business continuity plan. Because if you've got personal data in a system and that system becomes unavailable, that in itself is a breach, because you have made it impossible for the data subject to access their personal data. It's a breach, and therefore disaster recovery plans and business continuity plans become another part of what you should be encouraging and deploying to satisfy GDPR. We've got definitions for what a personal data breach means, but in our proposals and in our documentation, we put the security incident above this, because the security incident you want to know about. If you think somebody is trying to break in by repeatedly using an invalid password, you want to know about that. That hasn't been a breach because your password policy has prevented it, but it's a security incident. So we say record the security incident first and work out whether it constitutes a breach or not. But that's the definition of what constitutes a breach. Interesting to look at the ICO's website about what the commonest forms of breach are. And I'll walk over the other side now, because the one that's here at the top, this is 2016 data, by the way. I could have got the latest off the ICO's website, but it hasn't changed much. Loss or theft of paperwork, still the biggest breach. Nothing to do with IT. That shows why clear desk policy is so important. Data posted or faxed to an incorrect recipient. Again, nothing to do with IT. But when you get down to the world of IT, loss or theft of unencrypted device, information uploaded to web page, the frequency of occurrence is smaller, but the likelihood is the scale of this is much greater than the scale of these. So that's the thing to bear in mind, that if you've had information uploaded to your web page, SQL injection attack or something, and it's likely that hundreds of thousands of people will be aware of that, whereas losing one piece of paper with some sensitive data on it probably affects one data subject. So it's the scale that's so different. And in the security incidents here, you get some of the real basic ones, like failing to use the BCC box when sending an email to multiple people. That's a breach, or it's a security incident. So, if you don't notify within 72 hours, and you do subsequently, you have to explain the delay, and the ICO might accept your excuse or might say, well, no, you've broken the law a second time now, as I mentioned earlier. You need to be able to report promptly to the ICO. That's why having a policy and a procedure is so important, to get all of this done within 72 hours. You want to know about near misses yourselves, so that you can learn from the experience, even if it doesn't constitute a breach. And you want to encourage your employees to report breaches and security incidents. There's a real requirement here to change human behaviour, because most people will say, oh, I wonder if I can get away with that, because they could sack me for that. I'm not going to tell them about that if I can avoid it. But you want to encourage people to report security incidents. And therefore, your breach policy needs to cover what we call fair blame, which is that you state publicly nobody will be blamed for reporting a breach unless it's clear that it was willfully, criminally, or negligently performed. If it was just a genuine accident, or our own internal procedures fail, we want to know about it so we can do something about it. Now, one of the things I recommend that you do, and I'll uncover all of these, is to run a simulation of what is a breach. So we'll shut it. What is a breach? I'll let you absorb some of those, because it's not immediately apparent what's a breach and what needs reporting. And as you've only got 72 hours in which to work it out, you need to quickly be able to assess these sorts of things and say, well, that's a security incident. We need to learn from it. We need to do some training. We need to change our procedures. Or that's an out-and-out breach, has to be reported to the ICO. But you've only got 72 hours in which to come to that conclusion. It doesn't leave very long. I'm going to carry on because you'll get all of these slides. We use these sorts of things in workshop training, by the way, which is where some of these have come from. Another red circle. Throughout the GDPR, it recommends the use of data protection impact assessments. The Data Protection Act did mention something similar called a privacy impact assessment, a PIA, but quite frankly, I don't think I've ever come across anybody who performed a PIA just because the Data Protection Act said they should. Yes, people do carry out risk assessments and privacy impact assessments, but that's been largely ignored within the 1998 legislation. Now, this is a statutory requirement. If you're going to introduce a system that processes personal data, an IT system or a substantial piece of organisational activity, or modify an existing one, you have to carry out a data protection impact assessment, which is largely a risk impact assessment. And the bit I've written there, new systems. So if you're in the world of IT and colleagues are saying, we're going to introduce a new CRM system, we're going to introduce a new planning system, we're going to introduce a new web server, new website, all of these, if they're processing personal data, require a data protection impact assessment. And it's going to hit IT quite hard, because there's going to be lots of those. If you're doing automated processing, you have greater responsibilities and profiling. Loads of information about the whole of the GDPR and some of the specifics. The Information Commissioner's website is the place to start, but there's an organisation called the Article 29 Working Party, which gets its name because it was set up under Article 29, and they give some in-depth analysis of some of these subjects. So if you just type Article 29 Working Party into your search engine, you'll find their website easily enough. A lot of the big lawyers like Bird & Bird have published some great stuff on this subject. There's loads of it around, but the starting point nearly always is either the ICO's website or, in the world of cybersecurity, the Centre for Cybersecurity. You haven't got very long, 32 working days till the legislation comes in. So technically, organisations should be compliant within 32 days, but as I said in the introduction, it doesn't mean that we're going to get trampled all over by the ICO on the 25th of May. We just need to prove that we're on a journey. We haven't yet reached the destination. That's it. Well, as I said, you have to be clear about whether you're talking about GDPR or PDCR, because PDCR is quite clear that it is unlawful to send an email to somebody with a marketing message who didn't ask for it in the first place. They didn't consent to receive it in the first place. That's really black and white. So sending marketing emails you cannot do without consent. However, that doesn't rule out sending emails about contractual matters. If somebody has entered into a contract and bought a service from you or a product from you, you have a right to send them an email saying, thank you for your order, this is the details, this is when we'll ship, this is what you're entitled to. That's completely lawful. You don't need consent for that. So it's really important to differentiate between whether you're trying to satisfy a contract or whether you're trying to send out marketing materials. No, it doesn't make that distinction. They would simply just be data subjects, and the law applies to them regardless of their relation to you and your relation to them. Okay. But one of the things that you need to be really careful about, there's a lot of organisations trying to re-permission their mailing lists. They're sending out an email saying the law is changing. We'd just like you to confirm that you still wish to hear from us, and if so, check which types of information you want. Now that's really good practice to get those permissions renewed, particularly if you can become more granular and say, I want type A information but not type B information. But what you must avoid like the plague is sending that message to somebody who previously opted out from hearing from you. But this is largely PECR. This isn't necessarily anything to do with GDPR. If you type into search engine ICO guidance on controls and processes, that will bring up a document. I might even have it in my bag, where there are about 6 examples, and it uses carriers as one of the examples and explains why a carrier or courier is not a process. Because their email address itself is personal data. So, for example, if I were running a small sports club and I'd got 20 kids and 4 volunteers, and I want to tell them all about an event that's coming up, I should be using the BCC box, because if I put all 20 kids and all 4 organisers into the open circulation list, they all now have been given each other's email addresses, and they didn't give consent for that. So it's the email address itself that's the personal data, not necessarily the content of the email. Right. First of all, there'd be no problem about disclosing one of your work colleagues' emails to another work colleague, because you're all part of being the one same data controller. The term that the legislation uses is you're recipients of the same data. If you have mentioned the email address of a supplier to a couple of work colleagues, that in itself isn't a problem, because you presumably will, under the legislation, have a contract with that supplier to operate as a processor, and therefore anybody within the organisation who's potentially using that processor has a right to know about it. It's only when it goes outside of the organisation that it starts to be an issue. Either asked for their consent to process their data, to film them, because the imagery is personal data, and to pass on their details to the stadium to be able to provide catering. You could have asked for consent, but equally you could have said, we will do this because it's in our legitimate interests, and you either come to the conference under that basis or you don't. So that's the basis on which it becomes lawful to process the data in the first place. Sending emails, as I've said a few times now, is covered by different legislation. It's covered by privacy and the electronic communication regulations, and there's a whole set of different rules to do with what you can and cannot do with sending emails that you won't find anywhere in GDPR. Generally speaking, no, because, as I said, that all employees of an organisation, all part of being one and the same data controller. However, you could be accused of not having taken sufficient organisational controls to keep it secure, and particularly if it holds sensitive data, or special category data, because that generally has to be treated on a need-to-know basis. So, for example, if you've got a department, we work a lot with housing associations, if you've got a department dealing with antisocial behaviour, so they know about drug taking, they know about violence, they know about previous unspent criminal convictions. That's usually dealt with in a small and limited department on a need-to-know basis, and the software contains that data on role-based access control to a small group of people. And while it's not technically a breach, it would not be regarded as good practice if that information became known to the broader workforce. There's nothing to stop you writing to them. Right. Nothing to stop you writing to them at all without their consent. You can write to them, you can do a paper mail shot to them. There's nothing to stop you telephoning them unless they are registered with the telephone preference service. If they are registered with the telephone preference service to say, I don't want to receive marketing phone calls, it would be an offence to phone them for marketing. But if they're not on the TPS, which you can easily check, there's nothing to stop you phoning them. But what you must not do is send them an unsolicited email. It's a clear breach of privacy and electronic communication regulations. Well, first of all, remember that the retention policy is for you to decide. The law does not tell you how long to keep data, but other legislation does. So the law on contracts says that you must keep documents concerning a simple contract for 6 years, or if it was executed as a deed for 12 years. So that becomes your starting point. And then you say, well, should we just stick to that? Or can we justify keeping it any longer? Once you've decided your retention rules, different rules for different types of data, you then must stick to those rules. And you must either erase the data or anonymise it so that it's no longer containing personal identifiable elements. So the answer to your question is yes, you should be destroying the data that's held in your computer system just as diligently as you're currently destroying the paper documentation. There's lots of different ways that the data can be anonymised, and simply blanking out the name, address, telephone number, email address, date of birth, all the personally identifiable items is generally okay. What you've got to be really careful about is if you're operating a fast-moving database, particularly FMCG type things, that it's not suddenly coming back again because a source of data has picked it up and brought it back. So you think you've anonymised it, you think you've got rid of it, and then your matching record mechanism says, oh, we've got a new customer here, and overnight the whole thing's been recreated again. So you've got to give thought to, once it's done, you've got to sustain that, and how you do that is a technical challenge. Well, first of all, you should not be supplying email addresses direct to Facebook unless you've made it absolutely clear that you are using profiling as a method. And you've got to be really careful about how you declare that with complete clarity. A good example in the charity sector recently is charities are using a technique known as wealth profiling, where you can supply a database to an organisation called Prospecting for Gold. It lies behind the Sunday Times rich list. And they'll flag millionaires in that database. And they'll say, this guy's worth 1 to 5 million, this guy's worth 5 to 10 million, this guy's 50 million. So you might get your database back with 0.5% of your entire donor database flagged as millionaires, and you then treat them differently. Now, there's nothing illegal about doing that, but it's totally illegal if you didn't tell people that you're going to do it. So this is all about the transparency part of the legislation about what you must put in a privacy policy. It's a different relationship there because the organisations like LinkedIn have made it really clear that you, the consumer, the citizen, is the controller of the data. They're not the controller, they're just providing a bucket to keep data in. So you as the controller have your own decisions to make about what you allow and what you permit. Yeah, well, if you remember, I suggested that your breach reporting procedure should be at 2 levels. We've had a security incident. We now decide whether that constitutes a breach or not. So you should certainly encourage your employees to report that as a security incident. And when you perform the triage to work out how significant is this, you conclude, following your rules and the ICO's guidance, whether it constitutes a breach or not. In that situation, I would, if it was me, I'd want to be absolutely certain that even in that briefest window of time that you haven't had data exfiltrated, because in the world of IT, a nanosecond is enough, let alone half a day.